Do not be afraid. It is dark. They are alone. They are probably tired. The day before, they witnessed and attended as Jesus fed a huge crowd of 5,000 people with only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Do not be afraid. It is deep in the night, the 4th watch, sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Do not be afraid. The waves have been battering and battering and battering. The wind is against them, pushing their small boat farther and farther out into the sea, away from the safety of solid ground. Do not be afraid. Now, someone or something is walking toward them on the water. Do not be afraid. You must be joking. Fear seems like the only reasonable response. And yet that is what Jesus says. Do not be afraid. And not just here, but over and over, Jesus says it to his followers. Angels say it to people chosen for a special message or a special mission. God says it to God's people throughout the Old Testament. Do not be afraid. It is a comfort, but also a challenge and a call. Do not be afraid. Fear is a part of our daily lives. There is a reason that it is mentioned so often throughout the Bible. It is one of our most fundamental emotions. To a certain point, it is necessary and healthy. Fear keeps us safe. It alerts us to potential dangers and threats. It keeps us from being reckless and taking dangerous and thoughtless risks. It is certainly not all bad. Fear is an instinct that helps us to stay alive. But the flip side is that we are often not the best at directing our fear only to those things that are actual hazards. So fear can also be the burden that keeps us from living. It seems that we have a sort of odd fascination with these misplaced fears. We have names for every possible variety of irrational fear, and we use it as a fun game or a frequent Jeopardy category to be able to figure out the names of these specific phobias. But this fixation on the obscure, on the fears that we could not imagine having for ourselves, is a distraction or a cover. It shifts the focus away from the fear that is pervasive in all of our lives. We fear big things: nuclear war, terrorist attacks, mass shootings, incurable disease. And often without notice, we display our fear in our common thoughts and behaviors. Dr. Gina Bareka is a professor at the University of Connecticut, describes it this way. Fear fiddles with the phone until the call comes. Fear hides jewelry in paper bags underneath the sink. Fear rehearses every word of a conversation with a sister that ended coldly. Fear counts calories and counts pennies. Fear wonders about a child's friends, a child's grades, a child's future. Fear looks both ways, but still refuses to cross. Fear looks twice and still doesn't leap. And still, Jesus says, do not be afraid. When he is walking towards the disciples in the storm-tossed boat, he is quick to give comfort. After their cries of terror, he immediately says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." However, he does not immediately calm the waves and remove the wind. It is still a frightening situation. And then Peter makes a very strange decision. He takes a scary situation and makes it even scarier. He asks for a command to leave the relative security of the boat, to step out onto the choppy water, and to walk across the open sea. Most often when I have read this story, I have done so with an eye towards Peter's faith. Peter must believe wholeheartedly. He must know that Jesus is capable of anything, that Jesus could grant him the power to walk on water. But there is something else there, too. In reading the story again, I wondered, could it be that it is really fear that compels Peter out of the boat? Rather than let this mysterious person who seems to be able to walk on water get any closer to their little boat, he instead issues a challenge. Before trusting that it really is Jesus and that it is safe to let him get into the boat, Peter decides to test the waters. He is afraid and he reacts. He acts out of fear, and it is maybe not the best decision. How often is fear the driver of our decisions? How often do we let fear take over? And when we do, what are the consequences? One consequence of putting fear in the driver's seat is frequently that we end up going nowhere at all. We get stuck, paralyzed even, unable to decide on a course or unable to make the first move in our chosen direction. When Peter notices the strong wind and realizes that he is standing unprotected in the middle of the open sea, he is scared, and rightly so. But he is also paralyzed. He can't keep walking toward Jesus, but he also can't turn and go back to his friends in the boat. He is stuck. And unable to move, he starts to sink. If any of you had ventured a little ways down Jackson Street at just the right time recently, you would have seen a very real example of the paralysis that comes with fear. My dad, being kind and gracious, offered to help me get the last remnants of the fall leaves off of my roof so that they wouldn't freeze and thaw and damage shingles or something like that. So I tried earnestly to reach all of the leaves from the ladder. To reach them from the ladder so that I wouldn't actually have to get on the roof. Because, of course, getting on the roof means that you also have to get off of the roof. But alas, too many of the leaves were too far out of reach, so reluctantly, up I went. And the rest played out almost exactly as I might have predicted. I was totally fine until it was time to get down. I even got one foot on the top rung of the ladder. And then I was stuck. For far longer than I might want to admit, I was there on all fours, unable to get that other foot off the edge of the roof. It did not matter that Dad said helpfully, you really only have to go about 10 inches to get to the next rung. It did not help that he was there holding the ladder steady so it wouldn't move. It did not help that he said he would catch me or at least try to break my fall. I was stuck in my fear. Since we are not gathered in my front yard for this service, you can see that I eventually got over myself and found my way down the ladder. But it did give me the chance to reflect on the many other ways that fear paralyzes us. The ways that fear makes it feel like the only option is to sink right where we are. It keeps us from trying new things, from dreaming big dreams, from hoping for a better world and working to make it a reality. Fear cements us in our ruts of guilt or loneliness or jealousy or prejudice. Fear holds us back from being the people and the church and the community that God urges us to be. Living in fear makes even the tiniest first step look like a mile. So we just have to find a way to make ourselves feel safe, right? Thinking about fear reminded me of an experience I had with two of my best friends in Atlanta several years ago. Over the course of about a year, several teenagers had wreaked havoc in their neighborhood by breaking into houses. It was all petty theft, but the emotional toll was huge. 3 times they came to my friend's house. Twice they damaged doors and windows, but left before getting inside. But the 3rd time, they came all the way in, turned the house upside down, and took several things. But each time, they were successful in eliciting fear from my friends. Each time, my friends felt scared and vulnerable and violated. And each time, my friends tried new and different ways to deter future attempts and to make themselves feel more secure. They already had an alarm system, so they replaced the damaged door and windows with ones that were supposed to be more protected. They got new locks that were supposed to be harder to pick. They added video surveillance to their existing security system. And one day, as we talked about the break-ins and their efforts to secure their home, I asked them if they felt safer. They both immediately said no. They had reason to be afraid, to feel unsettled and insecure. Yet they also realized that there was no fortress they could build to fix these feelings, to make them feel safe enough. So another friend had an idea. A group of us gathered at their home for dinner. After we ate, we prayed together, and we took little pieces of yarn, and we went all over their home. We put those pieces of yarn between the pages of books. We tied them on doorknobs, on their key hangers, on their dog's crate, so that when they saw a piece of yarn, they would no longer just see a place where uninvited people had violated their home and taken their things, but they would instead see a reminder that they were surrounded by the love of their friends and the presence of God. They still had fear, but they chose not to let it have the final say. When fear has the last word, when our decisions and our actions are efforts to protect ourselves from feeling fear, we end up separating ourselves from one another and from God. We try to build walls, literal walls, to keep out people who are not like us, or emotional walls to keep from risking the connections that bring happiness, but also bring the risk of hurt. Nations build up stores of weapons. We have guards and officers circle us to give us the illusion of invincibility. We send messages that say, keep out. And then we miss the opportunity for hospitality. We miss the community of connection with those around us. We miss the peace of placing our trust and our hope in God. When Peter decides to step out into the water, he ends up alone. When the strong wind comes and he is frightened, he is no longer with his friends and his community of support in the boat, and he is not yet all the way to Jesus. Fear also kept him from inviting Jesus to come into the boat in the first place. Fear cuts us off. And how much more frightening is it to be frightened alone? We can't keep ourselves from ever feeling fear. Scary things happen. We face dangers, real ones and imagined ones and exaggerated ones, and it is natural to be afraid. The person writing the psalm that we read today, the one surrounded by enemies who trample, the one whose tears fill a bottle, knows this all too well. The psalmist writes, "When I am afraid." There is no question. We will all feel afraid at some point. But it is what comes next that matters. It is how we choose to respond. Do we choose to stay in the paralysis and isolation of fear? Or do we reach out? Do we choose to trust? Do we choose to move through fear and live out of the hope and faith in a God who reaches out a hand to save us? Fear will come. It's only natural. But the hope that we have in Jesus Christ is that we are set free from living in fear, even when the storms come, even when the waves batter the boat, even when the wind is against us. We can join with the psalmist and say, "In God I trust. I am not afraid." Alleluia. Amen.